Well, that's where I was at too. And I was curious about that, so I looked up Labor Day on the instrument of our society that always tells you the truth. I checked the internet, and I found out, yeah, okay, you got that one. I found out that Labor Day was initially established in the 1880s as a day to honor the significance of labor in the American society and economy. And it was set up because at that time, labor was a difficult situation. Wages were bad, low. Working conditions were horrible, sometimes unhealthy. Children were asked to work way before they should have been forced to do that. Hours were long, and so there was a need to sort of recognize the significance of labor and to honor that. And so somebody, and interestingly it's disputed as to whom, came up with the idea of Labor Day, that they should have a day when there would be a remembrance of labor and the importance of labor. Now, things of course evolved along the way. It became a time later in the 20th century of speech giving. People, prominent members of the community would give speeches, but always the focus was honoring labor. Today, like all of you, I had no idea what Labor Day was about. What it really is today, it's a day off, right? It's the unofficial end of summer. It's the last weekend the pools are open. Most importantly, it's the beginning of the football season. And that's kind of how we understand Labor Day in our world today. I want to think about Sabbath today. We kind of think about Sabbath the same way we think about Labor Day. We think about it as a day off. It's a day away from kind of the normal routine. But Sabbath is much more significant than that. I want to talk about Sabbath today because today marks the beginning of a series of, I think, 8 messages that I want to share with you that I have kind of in my mind entitled Keeping the Main Thing the Main Thing. Because in our faith, a lot of times we get really sidetracked on things that are really not very important. We focus on the trees, we can't see the forest. And all the details, all the doctrinal details or little things in our Christian faith seem like they become so important that we lose sight of what our faith is really all about. And so I want to call us back to the main thing. I want us to keep the main thing the main thing. Now, I came up, with a series of 8 things that I want to talk about. Your list of 8 would probably be different than my list of 8. But starting today and for the next 7 weeks, I'm going to talk about 8 things that I think need to be at the center of our minds. You might be surprised that Sabbath is one of them. But Sabbath is much broader, much more important and significant than what we have made it in our culture. Sabbath has kind of gone the way of Labor Day. We've lost the significance. We've lost the reason that it was originally established, and we've sort of made it into our own thing, what we want it to be. And we need to get Sabbath back to being Sabbath, because it is really important. So I want to read a couple of passages. The first is from the book of Exodus, which is from the Old Testament, from the 10 Commandments, found in Exodus chapter 20, beginning at verse 8. And this is the 4th commandment, is just the commandment dealing with the Sabbath day. It reads like this: "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now I want to turn over also to the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to be reading from chapter 2, beginning reading at verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." We had strict rules at my house when I was a kid growing up about what was appropriate on Sunday. My parents took the fact that it was a day of rest very literally, and they took an afternoon nap every Sunday. And they needed it, frankly, because living on a farm, they worked from long before sunup to long after sundown, and Sunday gave them the opportunity for a few hours in the afternoon to catch up just a little bit. Unfortunately, my parents, especially when we were younger children, made us do the same thing. And I preferred baseball to bed sheets when I was a kid, and I really wanted to be outside playing ball on this weekend day. They were few and far between during the fall, winter, and spring season of school, and taking a nap on Sunday afternoon was not my idea of a good time. There were strict rules about what was and what was not acceptable. And as a kid, and I don't think I feel the same way today, but as a kid, I had kind of determined whatever I wanted to do was wrong. And so I just kind of knew if I wanted it, it probably wasn't going to be appropriate for in my house to do that. And so I grew up with a lot of questions about Sunday. A lot of questions about what really is appropriate on the Sabbath. And my guess is that many of you grew up in a household like mine. Probably not all of you, but many of you. And probably you've had some of the same questions. What is appropriate on Sunday? What does it mean to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy? Now, interestingly, in these two passages, there's language that almost seems to be in conflict with one another. In the Old Testament, we read, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. A Sabbath to the Lord your God. But in Mark, Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man. Now you read those two things and it almost seems like they're in conflict. What does it mean if the Sabbath is a Sabbath to the Lord? And what does Jesus mean when he says that the Sabbath was made for man? And so my confusion about appropriate behavior on the Sabbath day continued. So what is appropriate for the Sabbath? What is the Sabbath day thing all about? I want to point out or make you recognize or help you to recognize a couple of things from the Old Testament commandment and from this Gospel of Mark. First of all, note that the Old Testament commandment is a positive one, not a negative one. 8 of the 10 commandments begin with thou shalt not. They're negative. Only 2, this one and the next commandment, the 5th, honor your father and your mother, are positive commands. This says, remember the Sabbath day. It doesn't say thou shalt not. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's a positive kind of statement. By the time Jesus was around, it had become very negative. And the Jewish people had created all kinds of regulations and rules around the Sabbath, so that when Jesus and his disciples were walking down the path and they were hungry on the Sabbath, and the disciples reached over and picked a couple of grains of wheat from a nearby field, they were criticized, not because they were stealing the grain. That was perfectly acceptable in the law. The law stated if you're walking down the path and you're hungry, you may reach over into the field and pick grain and eat it. Now, you can't go out in it and grab a bushel of it and take home with you. That would be stealing. But you are permitted to grab it and eat some of it. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was they did it on Sabbath. And that was harvesting. To pick grain was to harvest. To harvest is to work, and that's not keeping the Sabbath day holy. And so they had all of these rules and regulations around what was appropriate and not appropriate on the Sabbath day. What do we really, should we understand about the Sabbath day? I ask the question, how can it be the Sabbath to the Lord and made for man at the same time? Did you ever notice that conflict? Or what appears to be a conflict? A Sabbath to the Lord, and yet the Sabbath is made for man. And as I thought about that, it strikes me that those are in fact not mutually exclusive of one another. God, we read, rested on the seventh day. After he had created for 6 days, he rested on the seventh. Why? Because he was tired? Now, I think we all know better than that. God is certainly capable of working 6 days without being exhausted on the seventh day. God rested the seventh day, because he looked down through history and recognized that you and I were going to need the Sabbath day to call us back to him. God recognized that the world is going to pull us away, and that we would be very willing to follow, and that a day would need to be set aside to call us back to the Lord. It was a Sabbath to the Lord. But it's for us, it's for our purposes to be called back to God. When we're called back to commune with God, to renew that relationship with God on the Sabbath day, it's good for us. And when it's good for us as we're called back into relationship with God, he receives honor and glory from our being in relationship with him. And so the Sabbath becomes a Sabbath to the Lord. Those things are not mutually exclusive, as it turns out. God recognized what we were going to need. And so he gave us what we would need. The Sabbath was made for us. You understand? Because we're going to need it. But we need it because we need to be called back to God, and so in being called back into relationship with him, he is honored and glorified by our presence with him, and so the Sabbath is also a Sabbath to the Lord. So, what ought we do? What's right and what's wrong on the Sabbath? And I suggest to you this morning that to ask that question is to ask the wrong one. We get so hung up on what is permissible and what is not permissible on the Sabbath, as did the people of Jesus' day, that we lose sight of the point of the Sabbath. And we have to keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is not whether it's okay to do this activity or that activity on the Sabbath. We need to ask ourselves, what's the point? What's the purpose of the Sabbath? Why did God give us the Sabbath day? And I want to suggest to you 3 reasons, 3 purposes for the Sabbath. And the first one is to remind us of our need to be in relationship with God. You see, we lose sight of that. And so the commandments begins, remember the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day. Why should we remember it? Because God created in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. we see God's activity, we're reminded of our need for the presence of God in our lives. And the truth is, folks, the world doesn't want us to remember that. We are so easily pulled away from communion with God. We have so much stuff to do, so busy, so many important things going on in our lives, that if God had not set one day aside in 7 to remind us that our first priority has to be our relationship with Him, we would even easier than we do now, just go our own way, and God would be left in our dust somewhere. And so God gave us a gift to remind us of that which is most important in our lives. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, to be in communion with God on that day. Second reason I believe that God gave us the Sabbath, second purpose for the Sabbath, is for us to be restored physically and emotionally and spiritually. God rested on the 7th day, but not because He needed rest, because He knew we would need rest. God gave us the day so that we could be restored physically, because life in this world always has taken a lot out of us physically. That's why Mom and Dad slept every Sunday afternoon, working hard on the farm 6 days, and come Sunday they were exhausted and they needed a break physically, and so do we. And we need to be restored emotionally or mentally. I ask people a lot of times, how you doing? And I've said this before. Do you know what answer I get most frequently? Tired. Why? I think it's an emotional and mental tiredness that people are saying they are. The world is so demanding of us. We're at home, at work, at school. We got to take care of all of our finances stuff. TV demands our attention. Screens are always in front of us. We're constantly thinking, and our emotions are constantly being tested, and we become tired. And God recognized that that's the way the world was going to be. And He gave us a day to be restored. Slow down. To let our minds rest. To let our emotions rest. To get away from all of the normal stuff that we meet every day. It's a gift that God gave us to restore us to mental and emotional health. And finally, to restore us spiritually. Because God knows that the world is tugging at us all the time. And that we would need, and we do need, a time to be reminded to focus on Him. Which leads me to the last of the 3 things that Sunday is about, or the Sabbath is about. It's about refocusing. Our focus throughout most of the week is on our lives and on all the stuff that's going on around us, and God very easily gets put back behind us somewhere. And God knows and knew that that was going to happen, and so He gave us a day to refocus us spiritually on Him. So, what's appropriate on the Sabbath? The answer is anything that will help us remember that God is present in our lives, as He always has been, to remind or to restore us physically and emotionally and spiritually. By the way, that's why we gather and worship. Because we need to be restored spiritually. What's appropriate on the Sabbath? Whatever it is that will help us refocus our lives around that which is really significant in this world. So we gather and worship. We're reminded of God's deeds in all of history and His presence in our world today. We gather and worship to be restored spiritually. We rest to be restored, hopefully physically and emotionally. We gather together on Sunday morning in order to refocus our minds to that which is ultimately important. What's appropriate on Sunday? Whatever it is that leads us to that. See, when we set up the rules and regulations, this you can do and that you can't do, we've lost the point. The point is encouraging our relationship with Christ. So what are your Sundays like? By the way, the early church, very early on, moved Sabbath, Saturday to Sunday as a reminder of the ultimate act of God in Christ, His death and His resurrection on Easter Sunday morning. It's a reminder. It's to refocus our attention on that. What's your Sundays like? Are you keeping the Sabbath day holy? Are we allowing the gift of God to reorient us and our lives back to Him? That's the main thing. I don't know what you thought when I said that Sabbath was going to be one of the items of keeping the main thing the main thing. But we recognize that Sabbath is about refocusing and reorienting ourselves to Christ. It's a gift that God gives to us. And sadly, in our world, and too often in our own lives, we throw that gift away. Folks, we need this day because the world wants to pull us away. And it's the opportunity to be pulled back into communion with Christ. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the day. We thank you, Lord, that you love us and that you know us perfectly. And you knew from the very beginning that we would be pulled away.